Hello, good morning. Today, our guest is Professor John Loughlin. Hello, Professor John. How are you doing?
Hello, Lipton. I'm very well, thank you.
Yes, I'm great, John. So, John, today we'll be talking about Christianity and dignity. Why is Christianity important, John?
Well, I think human dignity is very important today as a concept, primarily because there are very powerful voices attacking the concept. And this is actually not a new thing. It actually goes back to the 19th century when people like Nietzsche and Karl Marx and Schopenhauer really mocked the notion of human dignity, and they were referring to Immanuel Kant's understanding of dignity. But I think that kind of rather cynical undermining of dignity has really survived into the 20th century and right up to today. And people like Steven Pinker, for example, from Harvard University, calls it a stupid concept, and others, think there's nothing particularly dignified about humans. Peter Singer, for example, talks about speciesism, that if we elevate human dignity as somehow that humans are above all other animals, that this is really unwarranted. I think that the concept of human dignity is very important for things like human rights. That if we don't know what a human being is, what do we mean by human rights? What about humanitarianism, humanitarian ventures, for example, from the United Nations or other bodies? Are they justified? Why save humans and not other creatures? So I think it is very important from that point of view, because human dignity is the basis of human rights and other kinds of humanitarianism. And once you really undermine that idea, you're undermining the concept of human rights itself. So I think it's very important to defend it. And going back, you can see after the Second World War, it was very clear that the Nazis and other forces like the Japanese and other groups had actually trampled on human dignity. And the UN Convention on Human Rights was created really in response to that tragedy and travesty of the Second World War. And I think sometimes we tend to forget what happened then, and we don't realize simply how important it is for us to really emphasize our own humanity and based on the notion of human dignity. So that's the concept of human dignity itself. I think, strangely enough, today it has to be defended against these different attacks that are being made on it from various quarters. And I think the Christian concept of human dignity is one of the very powerful justifications for saying that human beings are indeed special and that they deserve a special treatment. They do hold a special place in the world. And this is not speciesism, but it's simply recognizing the very important role that we as humans have in caring for the planet and caring for other species and caring for each other as well. And so this is why I think this Christian concept of human dignity, which applies to every single human being from the moment of conception to the moment of death, is really extremely important. And it is a rational justification based on faith, but faith that is based on reason as well, and on observation and empirical analysis. So anyway, that's why I think it's so important today.
John, I agree with you 100%. So our listeners may not know this, but prior to reading your article, I penned a piece and our articles are quite similar. John,
Yeah.
you hit the nail on the head. We have rights because of dignity. One
Yeah.
cannot discuss human rights without evaluating human dignity and the philosophical basis for human dignity. And I don't have a degree in philosophy, but I am surprised that so many people have been unable to identify this link. I'm shocked.
Yes, because I think part of the problem is really what we mean by human dignity. I think the Christian understanding of human dignity is rather different from other philosophical approaches to human dignity. For example, the disciples of Kant, the philosopher Kant, they would see dignity in terms of, simply in terms of autonomy. I have dignity because I am autonomous. I do what I want. I can control my own life. I can make my own decisions. I can accept. I can control the moment of my own death if I want, through assisted suicide or euthanasia or whatever. So this is one understanding of human dignity. I think the objection that is sometimes brought forward to the Christian concept of human dignity, well, there are a number of objections to it, but one of them is that it does undermine that kind of very individualistic understanding of personal autonomy, that I am beholden to no one outside myself. And since there's no God, usually, or even if there is a God, I make my own decisions. In other words, I am my own God. I can decide on my own life. And I think the Christian understanding is really quite different from this highly individualistic and libertarian understanding of what we mean by human dignity. Um, and yeah, other approaches are simply to say that the whole concept of human dignity is misplaced anyway, because humans aren't particularly special as a species. In fact, we're actually a very harmful species, and this is the David Attenborough kind of approach, or Greta Thunberg kind of approach, that we are almost like a scourge on the earth, and that we ought to be really removed from the earth. It's a very strange position for people to take, I think. But you find that expressed in movements like it's called the anti-natalist movement. This idea that by having children, we are really performing an unethical deed, because we're going to endanger the earth. We're going to endanger the planet, and we're going to help destroy these other species. So we should stop having children, basically. Find this notion as well. Now, this again is very different from a Christian understanding of what a human being is, and therefore what human dignity involves. That we do accept that we are autonomous, but we're autonomous actually within limits. We're not absolutely autonomous. We can make choices, but we can also make the wrong choices. How do we know they're wrong? We know they're wrong because there's a moral framework within we make these kinds of choices, and we also have a reason that we're capable of evaluating the consequences of our choices through our reason, which we've been given by God, we would believe, as Christians, and that all of our choices have consequences, and also that our choices are made in the context of our common humanity. That some choices might be good for me, or I think they're good for me, but they can have very harmful consequences on my fellow human beings. So I think I think that Christian understanding of dignity is also what I would call a communitarian or a relational concept, and dignity as a member of a human community, the community of mankind, in which anything I do will have an impact on all my fellow human beings, and therefore I have to actually use my reason to try to evaluate the impact that I'm going to have on those human beings. So I'm not simply a little monad of freedom rushing around colliding with all the other freedoms that are there. There's something more to me as a human being than that, because I have this membership of the human community as a child of God, and this is the Christian idea, is that we are sons and daughters of God, and therefore members of the same family. So I think this Christian idea of being made in the image and likeness of God and being members of the human community, in fact, it's an extremely rich one. And when we look at our Western history of Western Europe and all of the other societies been influenced by Western Europe, it has really produced some of the greatest achievements of our humanity. Not least the concept of human rights, which I would argue really has this firmest basis is in that Judeo-Christian tradition that developed in Western Europe. So anyway, those are just some ideas where I think human dignity, the Christian concept of human dignity, is important and much superior to other approaches to it that I think are basically quite superficial and actually harmful. And so the objection then by people like Pinker is that this notion of human dignity is a religious concept that's placed into debates about things like abortion, the dignity of the unborn child, in order to stop women making free choices to have an abortion or not. And I personally think this is actually quite an appalling position to take. But
Uh,
I
all
think
right
there is,
then.
yeah.
Yes. So, John, the Christian concept of human dignity is more sophisticated. It is a metaphysical concept. Christianity teaches us that we don't own our body and life is precious and worthy of preservation, whereas the
Yeah.
Kantian concept is equally sophisticated. I'm fond of the Kantian concept because it is the most sophisticated secular response to Christian dignity. But a
Yeah.
flaw inherent in the Kantian concept is that dignity is linked to autonomy and reason. According to
Yeah. Well,
Christianity, dignity is unmerited. We have
yeah,
dignity
well,
because we're made in the image of God.
yeah, I think there's a certain understanding of reason that you find in Kant, which is the Enlightenment's understanding of reason, which I think what Kant was trying to do, and I think you have to distinguish between the Kant himself and the Kantian understanding of dignity and freedom and autonomy, and the neo-Kantian interpretation of Kant, which is the one I just gave, which is that we're a kind of an absolute uh, freedom to do whatever we like without any higher authority over us. But I think what Kant meant was we have the freedom to um, participate in universal laws that can be discerned by reason. And I think you're right. It is a very sophisticated understanding, which is, I think, quite close to the Christian one. But
But the
it's
difference between Kant and Christian is that Christian dignity is unmerited. Christianity is teaching us that life itself is beautiful and worthy to be cherished, whereas Kant, he is a logician. Kant is saying we have dignity because of our capacity to reason and analyze and autonomy, etc.
yeah,
Life is
that's
important to Kant, but Christianity places a premium on life.
yeah, that is true. I think you can distinguish between if you like, a functional dignity and an intrinsic dignity. And I like to go back here in the history of theology and go back to Irenaeus of Lyon, who was the first really to emphasize what the Christian concept of dignity meant. And he took that passage from the Bible, from the Greek Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible, which says that man is made in the image and likeness of God. Now, he distinguished between image and likeness as some two rather similar but different things. In Hebrew, it probably means the same thing, but in the Greek translation, it was developed and then further developed by people like Irenaeus and the other fathers of the church who came later, to say that we can never lose the image of God, but we can lose the likeness. And what he meant by that is we're made in the image of God because we share in God's capacity to reason. We're like God in the sense that we can reason, and but also because we can make choices. We've got both reason and freedom, and these are both contained in the concept of the image of God. And what that means then is that we are like God in intrinsically. We have this capacity, but we can misuse it. And at the fall, described in the Bible, we lost the likeness. Now the likeness is to behave like God, and then finally Jesus Christ will show us what that means. You know, he gave us the example of what it means to behave like God as a human being. He was God, but he was also a human being, and so that through him, then we recover the likeness. This is the kind of old teaching of the fathers of the church. Now, I think what's important about this is that this idea that we can never lose the image of God. In other words, we possess as human beings an intrinsic dignity. And I think the problem with the Kantian or the neo-Kantian approach is that if you lose, if dignity is defined by our capacity to reason and also to, in more recent phenomena, to enjoy life, to to lead a full life, being able to dress oneself, etc. Then the concept of we can actually lose that, through old age, through illness, through mental problems, through handicaps of various kinds. We might end up saying, well, I can't actually dress myself, I can't go to the toilet, I can't do this, I can't do that. Therefore, I've lost my dignity. Now, a Christian would say this is actually not the case, that in fact, we cannot lose our dignity as human beings. We always have that dignity. And even during the Nazi period, the Nazis could never take away that intrinsic dignity of the people in the concentration camps, the Jews and others. So I think the importance of the Christian concept then is it's really this idea of intrinsic human dignity that can never be lost. Therefore, every single human being, whatever their condition, whatever their mental capacity, whatever their degree of education, however far they've fallen in the world, whether they're an alcoholic lying in the street or whatever, they still have that dignity. And therefore, our responses to them must always be on the basis that they still have dignity. Now, if a person cannot dress himself, cannot get up out of bed, is paralyzed, or whatever the condition is, or is in a nursing home or towards the end of their lives, then the other members of the community, the human community, and particularly Christians have this in mind, must help them to lead that dignified life. So it's Stanley Hauerwas talks about this. It's the notion of hospitality, of bringing into, allowing to come into one's life in times of need or of disability, the other community who will help us through love to raise us up, to keep raising us up, to lead that dignified life. And I think that is actually very important. And that's probably the key difference, is that notion of intrinsic dignity that we have that will really inform debates about, we find today, about euthanasia or abortion or about homelessness or all of these, immigration, etc. I think that notion that every single human being has that intrinsic dignity, been made in the image of God, however they behave, they might behave not according to this. Like, none of us can really measure up to Jesus Christ behaving in the likeness of God, but we will always have that image of God. And the challenge for us as human beings is to fully realize that in our lives, and to help each other to realize it in the human community.
John, so remember earlier I said that some time ago I published a piece, and this piece is titled "Why Atheism Cannot Replace Christian Morality." And
Yeah.
I'm going to read a snippet of the piece.
Okay.
Fortunately, individuals can experience dignity stemming from the sophistication of Christian morality, despite the inability to express autonomy or act as reasonable agents, arguing that being engendered in the image of God makes us dignified is a more vigorous defense of human dignity than any doctrine a secular perspective can propose. Atheists may respond by declaring that intrinsic value indicates that a property is valuable for its own sake, independent of external relations. Therefore, regardless of God's existence, human life has intrinsic value. For obvious reasons, this reply fails to undercut religious objections and instead raises more questions. If atheists think that the ethos of life is to promote human flourishing, then life is worthwhile because of its usefulness. In short, value would not depend on intrinsic worth.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, very good. I did read your article and I thought it was very good actually, and I think we had a very strong convergence on our ideas. I think the problem I find, yeah, we come back here to this notion of usefulness. You know, is human life useful? Am I leading a useful life? Am I capable of acting in a rational way, a reasonable way? Do I have that autonomy in everyday life? And if I don't have that, then I've lost my dignity. And I think this for me is one of the big problems with modern ethics, is that this idea that our dignity is a functional notion, and I think atheism really, it's almost like an act of faith on their part that we have human dignity, even though they would try to say it's rational. But in fact, it's much more like there's really no basis. Someone like Peter Singer is probably right. He says, I'm an atheist, and this is where my atheism brings me, that, you know, I think some animals are more important than human beings, like a rare monkey is more important than a human baby. And if there's a fire, I save the monkey rather than the baby. And there's a kind of preference utilitarianism that would lead to that ethical conclusion, which I think we would find pretty horrifying, most of us anyway. I think Christianity would say, no, this is really quite wrong, that it's the baby which is made in the image and likeness of God, not the monkey, and that we should save the baby in the fire. And a baby is pretty useless, actually, as a baby, in terms of what they can do and what they can't do. They're absolutely, totally dependent on their parents, and particularly on their mother. So they're of less worth than some other creature, or, you know, an adult who does have all their capacity. So I do find that reasoning rather rather frightening, actually, if this becomes the basis of public policy and philosophical approach to these kinds of issues. I don't know if that actually addresses
John,
your.
John, I
Yeah.
don't claim to be philosophically astute like yourself, but even a cursory reading of philosophy and ethics will demonstrate that many prominent philosophers of atheism are inept. And I'm being polite. Let me give a brilliant example. The chain of command. There is always a chain of command. Atheists have a problem with humans being at the head of the chain of command, but they don't have a problem with stronger animals eating weaker animals.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think yeah, I would say that, you know, our Christian understanding, our, let's call it our Christian anthropology, is actually much richer than an atheistic anthropology, because I think what it recognizes is that the human being, it, thanks to the gift of reason and freedom which God has given us, and thanks to our use of these gifts in order to develop what we call civilization, that our what we are as human beings so far transcends our nearest relatives that it's like the difference between, you know, a whale and a mouse. Even some atheists recognize this. People like Raymond Tallis, who wrote a book on
Yes.
on this topic, and he said, our nearest cousin in evolutionary or genetic terms is an orangutan, but the difference between an orangutan and a human being is the difference between an orangutan and a worm who's on the ground or something like this. But I think there's something absolutely astounding about what a human being is, and this would be my starting point, that we, and I think this is what the ancient classical authors actually did recognize. Interpret rather differently from Christianity, but I think Christianity in the early phases took on some of these ideas which they got from the classical authors. They had this, it's just simply the wonder of what a human being is, and our capacity to do these things. Now, if that's the case, if we have these characteristics of reason, of freedom, of the capacity to build entire civilizations, to build cities, to build, to go to the moon, to solve the COVID crisis by inventing vaccines. I don't know how many gorillas have been working in laboratories to do these kinds of things, or apes or orangutans. It's human beings who are doing this, and I think that gives us a status on the planet which is absolutely unique. We are a unique species. We're not simply a greater ape or something like this. We are something that far transcends that. And this is why I would emphasize the idea of one of our characteristics as humans is our capacity to transcend our situations. And that's what I mean by reason and freedom, that we have this capacity to think, to go beyond the immediate circumstances in which we are living, to reflect on our past, on our future, to ask questions about, where we came from, where we're going, why are we here? And it may be that a gorilla up on the mountainside is lying chewing grass, asking the same questions. We just don't know. But what we do know is that human beings do ask these questions. We also have the gift of language in which we can actually express these ideas, express these concepts. We can discuss them with each other. We can discuss them like we're doing now through this amazing capacity called the internet and Zoom, and that will be broadcast on radio waves. These are all inventions of our humanity. And
John,
I just,
humans also have the capacity to be objective. So some anthropologists have been arguing that animals may also be able to express morality, but there's no consensus in psychology and anthropology that this view ought to be taken seriously. But what we do know is that human beings are objective. As a human being, I can say it is wrong to harm animals. As a
yeah,
human being, I can also argue that racism is problematic and we should not enslave blacks. But
yeah,
animals are not objective.
yeah. Well, I think, I mean, nature and the rest of nature outside of our humanity is simply about species survival. It seems to be about hierarchies, as I think you mentioned at the beginning. In a troop of chimpanzees, you'll have a boss, you'll have a male chimpanzee who has a harem of others, and they fight each other for domination within that group, etc. So I don't think they're doing this out of any philosophical conviction. As far that's simply how they've evolved as species. Now, human beings have some of those characteristics because I do believe we have evolved. I do believe in evolution, and I have no problem with that idea, and I do accept that we have some of those animal characteristics of aggression and domination and hierarchies, etc. But we have something else as well on top of that. And I think what we have, I would put it down to this idea of transcendence, that we can actually go beyond those circumstances in which we have found ourselves, and that our capacity to do this is, I would say, really begins with our discovery of religion, of, of, of faith. And uh, for example, all other species will simply hoard their food, their supplies, they'll fight to keep it, and then they consume it, and then they find other through their, they don't have agriculture, so they hunt or they pick it from trees or whatever. But human beings are the only species, as far as I know, who will actually sacrifice some of those goods which they have collected or produced, and sacrifice them to a higher power of some kind. Our humanity is essentially religious. I would say that we are essentially religious beings, and that the notion of sacrifice is one expression of this. The notion of worship is another expression of it, that we human beings, way before Christianity, have always seen worship some kind of higher power or higher being or gods, but they have different names. But that is, again, a characteristic of what we are as human beings. I don't see that in any other creatures. I know that some kind of modern secularists are always trying to find these, oh, look at this painting by a chimpanzee or something like this. It's true that you might find some of these incipient ideas present in, let's say, the higher primates, and it would seem that dinosaurs did care for their babies and so on, but there's no real equivalent of what we have achieved as human beings and our status on the planet that we have as human beings among any other species. So we are absolutely unique in that regard.
Not at all. Animals cannot be compared to human beings. And Eileen Goldberg, she had a PhD. She had an article published in 2011. I read it some years ago, titled "Only Humans Have Morality, Not Animals." And she was responding to Dale Peterson, who wrote a book, "The Moral Lives of Animals." So as I
Yeah,
said, even in science, there is no consensus that animals are moral.
yeah. Well, I think to have morality, you must have freedom, and this is a freedom that is based on our capacity to reason. So I think in that old concept I spoke about earlier about of the fathers of the church, um, uh, being made in the image and likeness. So there's a lot of debate about what image meant among them, and there were different ideas, but there was a kind of a consensus that at least part of it is the idea that we do have reason, and that God is the word, the logos, who is also God, who came on earth in the form of Jesus Christ. But we somehow share in that capacity of reason that God has. But we also have a choice. We can make the wrong choices. We can choose evil as well as choosing good. But and that those choices are based on our reason. Our reason could be damaged, it could be flawed, it could be weakened by sin or making the wrong choices, but we still have it. Now, there's no evidence whatsoever that any other animal or any animal has this capacity. I think they can make choices between maybe a ripe apple or a less ripe apple. Is it really a choice? I don't know. I'm not a zoologist. I don't know. But I don't know. I don't think you can really compare the human species with any other species, and we should be proud of that as human beings. We should say this is so wonderful that we are like this, and we should emphasize it, and we should say this is just our glory of as human beings. And it's also true, and this is again what the Christian idea is important. It's true that we are flawed human beings, that we're not God, that we can behave as if we were God, and we can make a mess of things, that we can destroy the planet, we can destroy each other, we can have wars, all of these things that you mentioned, racism, for example, or slavery. We have done this, and we're capable of doing that. But we're also capable of recognizing that this is wrong, and we're capable of, the example I gave earlier, of devising a system of human rights, the UN Convention on Human Rights, UN Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, which explicitly acknowledges that human dignity is the basis of all other human rights. We can actually come through this horrible period of the Second World War and of Nazism and violence that the war represented, and come up with this wonderful, excuse me, this wonderful system of human rights, which is often not fully implemented, is often violated, but at least we have an objective standard. And again, I think I agree with you that there's an objective standard by which we can evaluate our behavior.
John, John, do you know what is quite hilarious? For one to have rights, you must have duties. If you're unable to be responsible, you cannot have rights. Animals cannot consent. Animals have no duties whatsoever. So how can animals have rights?
I fully agree.
Yeah, it is so laughable.
And again, the Christian idea is that with rights go responsibilities, and I think, but once again, we're coming back to an anthropological issue, which is the nature of the human being. That we do have rights, we can behave however we want, but there are consequences for our behavior, and we have a responsibility when we make choices to behave in certain ways to evaluate the impact of those choices, and that is to have responsibility. But what does responsibility mean? It's responsibility to our fellow human beings and also to the planet. We are responsible for the burning of the rainforest in the Amazon, or pollution, or climate changes. These are all things that engage our responsibility, and I think then through the exercise of our reason, this wonderful gift we have from God of reason, we can devise solutions to them. And I think this is actually what's been happening. We do discuss these issues, and I think COVID-19 is a great example of our humanity at its best in terms of how we can respond to a crisis that's a virus that's killing human beings and wiping out very vulnerable people, and others maybe not so vulnerable. And we have responded to that in the most amazing way by discovering these vaccines. And this is, in my opinion, it's just quite an incredible credit to our humanity. And that is also responsibility as well. I mean, we are responding to this in this way because we're saving lives, we're saving our fellow human beings. I
But
would just also say
John,
about
we're wrapping up. But before we wrap up, I want you to briefly comment on dignity in the Greco-Roman world, and after doing so, briefly explain why secular philosophies could not avert the evils of the Nazi regime.
Okay, well, the first question, human dignity in the Greco-Roman world. Well, dignity had two meanings then. One was dignity, which meant one's position in a social hierarchy. So they talked about the like when Cicero wrote a famous book called De Officiis, which is on duties, which is really about dignity. And it refers to one's place in a social system. So if you're a priest, a Roman priest, you had a dignity. If you're a slave, you had a dignity, which is the office of slave. If you're the emperor, is another dignity. So that's one old concept of dignity. Now the other concept, which also Cicero expresses, is the notion that because we have reason, we have an intrinsic dignity which is above all others. So I think in that same piece, De Officiis, on duties.
Debbie and Scott, could you please call extension 225? That's Mrs. Scott. Could you please call extension 225?
Hello,
Thank you.
John?
Yeah, I hear a voice in the background.
Yeah, you can continue. Sorry about that. You can continue.
Okay, don't worry. So the so now the Christian church took Cicero's idea and made it universal, because in the Greco-Roman world, this was not a widely held concept, actually, this notion of intrinsic dignity. And certain sections of humanity had no dignity in that second sense of the word. So a slave didn't have that dignity. A slave was simply the property of his master. Women, generally speaking, had no dignity because they were the properties of their husband. And in the Greco-Roman mythological system as well, if you look at some of the ancient myths, we're really going back to the Babylonian and Assyrian myths, human beings were really thought of simply as the creatures of the gods, that we were simply the plaything of the gods, or we existed simply to serve the gods, and we weren't simply taken seriously. Now, what the Bible did, go back to Genesis and the creation story, is that it elevated every single human being up to being made in the image and likeness of God. Now, before the Bible, this concept was actually nowhere to be found in the ancient world. And the notion of being made in the image of God was used by certain groups like the Pharaoh of Egypt or certain rulers, but not about human beings as such. So I would say this is a great breakthrough in terms of our understanding of humanity. So does that answer your first question?
Yes, it does. Christianity liberalized the concept of human dignity. So in your piece, you reference an article by Josiah Uber, and I actually read that article. And in the article, he comments on the various types of dignity in the ancient world. So meritocratic dignity, civic dignity, etc. Again, as I said earlier, Christian dignity is unmerited. It does not need to be, we don't need to earn Christian dignity.
Okay, yeah, exactly. It's what I would call intrinsic dignity.
Yes.
Yeah. So the second idea I think that secular liberalism would find it very difficult to really defeat Nazism. Nazism was defeated by force of arms, basically, and it was. I think it was because our Western, either capitalist system in the West, the United States, Europe, or the communist system in the East were threatened by the Nazis. And so I don't think they were fighting for the dignity of, let's say, the Jews. I think most of the powers were actually not that interested in the fate of groups like the Jews or Black people or other, the Slavs, etc., who were being enslaved by the Nazis. But they did see the Nazism as a threat to their own economic and political interests, which had to be stopped. And Hitler did attack these different countries, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union. The Japanese attacked the Americans, Pearl Harbor. So these were reactions based on a threat to their states and to their populations. I don't think there was any particular ideology underlying it, but nevertheless, I think I don't think that the response to Nazism as an ideology by secular liberalism, particularly of the kind of neo-Kantian type, is not very robust. It's sort of not. I think the Christian response is actually much more rigorous and much more universal.
And as you note in your article, the Nazi philosophy adds some Nietzschean undertones.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think what worries me most in all of this debate is this undercurrent, which goes back to Schopenhauer, actually, who was, Nietzsche was a great admirer of Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, and both were attacking Kant. But you also find it in Karl Marx and Freud as well. It's really this attempt to undermine the Judeo-Christian concept of human dignity, which, Kant had a particular, I would call, diluted form of that. But I think Kant's origins were also within that tradition. But he was trying to justify human dignity on purely rational grounds without reference to God, which is part of the Enlightenment project. I think that sort of undercurrent of Nietzscheanism, which you find within fascism. The whole debate was Nietzsche the forerunner of the Nazi Party? Well, certainly
Well,
his
no.
sister.
The answer is no. His sister, as you are about to say, fabricated his work, but people still conflate Nietzsche with the Nazis.
Yeah, no, I mean, Nietzsche was too intelligent to be a Nazi, I think, too cultured. But I do think there's a kind of, there's a sort of an undercurrent of violence and nihilism that we find in our Western societies, our Western cultures. You find it in the whole cult of violence of the fascists, for example, and then the Nazis after them, probably derives from that. I wonder if modern media through television and TV series, where there's a from the 1960s and 70s onward, we find this nihilism and violence becomes more and more prominent. And I wonder if the roots of that are not really going back to that undercurrent, which you can discern there, which I do think goes back to nihilism rather than maybe Nietzsche
Yes.
was a nihilist and the death of God, etc. So there's a whole cultural analysis that you could probably make there, and which some people have made, which I think is very important.
And
I
in secular philosophies like communism, man is not the center of the doctrine. So in communism, man is but a cog in the machine. Man
yeah,
exists to serve a greater purpose, and this purpose is related to the state.
yeah, yeah. I think, well, I think you could say it's in the Marxist approach. It's there's a kind of because of the class basis of it, the proletariat, which takes power, takes control of the state. The state will wither away, and they will then have a kind of utopia in which you can read Plato in the morning and play on your violin Bach's concertos in the afternoon. This is the kind of Marxist utopian idea. The problem is that the proletariat is represented by the state. This is the Leninist interpretation of it. So the party will represent the class. The party must control the state, and this becomes an absolute power. And the individual within that, the individual person, is actually crushed by that party state. And we did see this in the Soviet Union. There's no, we have the empirical evidence that this actually happened, and not just in the Soviet Union, but in other countries like Romania, Albania, Yugoslavia, etc. We're seeing it today in China. It happened in Cuba. So it's Marxist ideology, which under a certain interpretation of Marxist ideology, I would say, going back to Marx himself, and which is intrinsically atheist, which underlies this crushing of the human person and this trampling of human dignity. And I think after the Second World War, the people who drew up the Convention of Human Rights were also conscious of that communist experience and experience of the Soviet Union. And they never really fully took on board the idea of human rights. And some of their fellow travelers today, the left-wing academics in universities, are probably within that tradition as well, maybe without even knowing that they are, maybe unconsciously parodying some of these ideas. So again, we come back then to this idea of our humanity made in the image and likeness of God, called to share God's life, called to transcendence. And in the process of doing that, creating this amazing civilization, which is based on reason, it's based on science, based on objectivity, it's based on art, it's based on music, it's based on poetry, philosophy, etc., etc. Freedom is an essential component of this. Human rights are an essential component of this. And we should do everything we can really to protect that heritage that is now being challenged in so many quarters in our Western, among our Western elites, including the universities. And this is why I am very much against this notion of the cancel culture and revisionism that really would seek to deny that, and try to build something new from scratch, from zero. All revolutions have tried to do this. We'll have the year zero and then we begin anew, whether it's the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Maoist Cultural Revolution of the Gang of Four in the 1960s. And they will all fail and they all crush our humanity in one way or another. And I think this has to be resisted very much.
It is indisputable, Professor. Man attained its highest level of development in Western civilization, and this view has been posited by serious academics and early philosophers. It's just,
Yeah,
it doesn't make sense for us to debate it anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, it's a very strange and dangerous phenomenon that we're witnessing at the moment. Like here in Britain, where I live, it's almost, universities are just very difficult places for people with certain political views to work. And if you are a social conservative, believing in the heterosexual family as the best unit in which to bring up children, it's almost impossible to say this publicly now in our universities here, and it's just quite incredible what is happening, I think, and very, very dangerous. And I do think it is. It has to be resisted, and I would be of the Kenneth Clark school of thought, which sees his TV series.
Oh, Kenneth Clark, yes, I remember it. It's a bit old. I'm just 28, but I remember his story.
Well, it is old, but it's worth watching again. Actually, I watch it every now and again.
Yes.
And I was young then when I watched it, but it's such a wonderful sort of expose of this thesis that you just said about Western civilization.
Yes.
Being
This is the point in psychology. Man first attained the highest stage of intellectual development in Western civilization. And there's a very interesting academic from Germany, and his name is George Ooster Dietrich. Don't quote me, I could be mispronouncing his name, but his papers are utterly brilliant, and I interviewed him some time ago.
Oh, okay.
But it's not debatable. But unfortunately, John, I could continue to talk for the next 2 hours, but after wrap up. But we'll continue to talk via email.
I have to go and sing tonight. I sing in 3 choirs, and I'm singing Talus Bird and Palestrina.
Okay. All right. So we'll definitely continue our conversation via email. Bye, John.
Okay. Bye-bye.